You have made the best choice of your day, possibly your year, to come to this session. Because we thought we were going to just be chatting, the two of us, and we'd already decided that, you know, Cameroon trumps Belgium at any time, so this was going to be a very easy conversation. But now that there are other people, we might have to be a little less insular. So thank you for coming to the session. We were also saying, Stain and I, that the name doesn't really give very much away. So I'm just going to do a very quick introduction, if I can.
Yeah, go ahead.
And just tell you a little bit about what to expect, what to expect very broadly is a conversation, given that we've been talking about audience engagement, about how, in Stain's experience, what that has looked like, trying to engage an audience with content. I think his perspective is very subversive, considering how journalists traditionally consider audience engagement, and so he'll talk a bit about sort of approaching it from a different perspective. My perspective at The Guardian has been very much more traditional, and trying to go from seeing our content as being for a UK audience and then to being a global newsroom, and then how do you engage audiences across languages. So we'll talk, I'll ask him a few questions for a little bit, but what we're really keen to hear is that actually we don't think that this session is going to offer you very many answers and sort of, you know, go back to wherever you're from and do X, Y, or Z. But we know that you guys probably have a lot of different experience and have tried a lot of different things. And so maybe this could be the kind of UGC session of the event where we get you to collaborate with us and tell us what you've tried, what your experiences have been. So firstly, Stain, do you want to tell us who you are and, you know, why do you qualify to speak on the subject of languages?
Sure. My name is Stain. That's what it says on the paper. I work for Internews. Internews traditionally works around media development, so supports local media around the world. But I'm specifically working in the humanitarian department, which means that we fly into emergencies and try to set up what we call two-way communication channels so people can get involved in the conversation, can voice their concerns, can comment, criticize if they want on what is going on and how they feel about it. So that means that in a very specific context, we have to set up something that very quickly gets trusted, used, and also is being listened to. That means that on the other end of that conversation, that's not us, and that's where maybe I think we play a bit of a different role than a typical media house would. I'm not so much interested in them talking to us. I'm actually interested in them being able to talk to whoever gets to make decisions. So we play, if you want, much more the role of a mediator, which is something that I've thought about in this job. Media might have been doing and still could be doing, and some of you are doing in the whatever context that you're working in. My background is also journalism in Belgium. But that is very explicitly our role, like in an emergency in countries where suddenly, I don't know, the typhoons or the civil wars are happening and people try to navigate and get information and make informed decisions. So that's the broader context, I think.
So tell us how the project that you're working on, News That Moves, fulfills this role as media as mediator.
Yeah, I think that's why I'm here sitting, and that the title is Knocking Down the Language Barriers, because what happened right now was that we saw the refugee crisis happening at the borders of and in Europe. And that really poses with a few new challenges in the way that very often how we solve the language issue is we recruit among what we call in the lovely NGO jargon the affected population, except that here the affected population was moving, was not interested in staying anywhere where they were, and that the channels that were available were speaking another language. No refugee is interested in listening or reading what Greek media is talking about. So you have a mismatch there that we had to solve. So we've set up News That Moves, which is a website, of course thinking about the fact that they're traveling, but that they could have access to the website all along the trail. But very quickly, of course, that also means you have to translate things into the languages of these refugees. You make a quick calculation, you go for the biggest language groups. In this case was Arabic, was Farsi, and we wanted to keep the news pace as much as we're an NGO. The context is changing a lot, the policies were changing a lot, the services, this has been a very challenging environment just because Europe didn't know what to do, and humanitarians didn't know what to do, and in the meantime these people kept coming. So we kept that news space, but we also had to translate all of that content into the different languages, into a process which is very familiar to journalists, that includes like fact-checking, that includes like translating it into like very dense policies into very clear language without losing accuracy. And all of those mechanisms where you use journalistic skills had to be pushed through a translation process as well, into Arabic, into Farsi, into Greek, because we wanted to cater for the biggest host population. Greece, of course, has played an important role in this whole setup. And that in itself was also interesting to see how we could, with that model, how we could get engagement going when we were translating things into Arabic, but what kind of Arabic? When we were translating into Farsi, but that's, I mean, I'm not an expert, but there's Dari, there's Farsi, there's all these other things that actually, that is what people are talking about. And if you want to get engagement going, you better speak their language. And I think that's where we see that it's much more important, not so much that people understand what you're saying, but that you find a language, and that has a lot more aspects than just Arabic or Farsi. You find a language that people are comfortable in talking back to you, and share, like asking a question in a language without being afraid that not only they have to ask for something, which makes you, like, exposes your vulnerability, but then also having to worry about whether your grammar is correct, whether like somebody takes you serious, when you're making mistakes, when you're like have to revert to your like school Arabic that you learned until you were 14 maybe, and then suddenly this big powerful machine you have to sort of enter, like the humanitarian system or local governments. Like how does that work? And that's something that we've set up in September until now has been a very interesting sort of process on which, like, how can we improve these? And I have lots of anecdotes of how language and translation can go wrong as well. Even though it's Arabic, when you say that the boats are on strike, people, instead of thinking, the ferries are on strike, they actually were thinking that it was the smugglers who were on strike, which is a confusing message in many ways. But boats was what they were coming from, ferries or ships, and the equivalent in Arabic was what they were using to move onwards from the Greek islands. So all of these very specific things is, for me, a very interesting process, and has been a very interesting process of like going from being understood to something that people actually engage with.
So I was just thinking about the fact that actually in what you do now, you sort of wear two hats, right? You've got an experience and a background as a journalist, but now you're sort of more of a humanitarian. And so making the argument for why anyone would spend that money to get the logistics and the grammar right to engage these people makes absolute sense. But then how do you make that case to a newsroom? How do you make that case to an editor that this kind of, diligent work is worth doing? How does that enhance the quality of the journalism?
I mean, I've been here all day and listening about audience engagement, and if I'm really honest, like so far, and I don't want to like be disrespectful to anybody in the room, and I haven't heard everything, and I don't know what everybody's doing, but it's actually still news rooms, media houses, having the story and handpicking a quote or a picture that fits their narrative. Like, there's a bomb exploding, do we have a picture? Can we get consent? Are we the first ones to have that picture? Or do we have and all of these things. That's for me not audio engagement. Like, at least that is maybe audio engagement, but that's not what I'm interested in. I go in and I don't know what they want to talk about. I have no clue what the story is. I want to hear from them, like, what is it that you want to talk about? And that for me is a very different engagement where if you have a closed process and journalism, and I've been doing this thinking, like since I left journalism and entered this kind of work that I'm doing right now, is like, what is the difference? Because very often we're mistaken for journalism. We're also called internews. That's very, very confusing for a lot of people. But I don't consider myself as a journalist anymore. I use techniques, and it sometimes looks like journalism, but I have a very different purpose in it altogether. And so having that, that idea that you are in charge of the story, and that you can like handpick your quotes, your pictures, your videos that you want to use to tell your story, that's something that I want to get away from, and saying, okay, like here is actually a platform, a channel, and like what is it that you want to talk about? That comes with challenges, again, which also includes language, like how do you not expose people in their maybe, like people who are not so articulate, people who are not necessarily used to formulate a decent question, people who have a story, but it doesn't come as a nice story to you. Like how much do you engage with that? How much do you pull that in, polish it, turn it around, give it a nice headline, and then people don't recognize it as their story anymore. It's your story. So, I mean, it comes with a whole other set of issues that I don't have any answers to, so I didn't promise any. But for me, that's a fascinating process. And I'm wondering how many of the news houses are ready to say, okay, we actually don't know what our story is. One of the biggest innovations I've seen recently was not Snapchat or how to use it. One of the biggest innovations that I've seen, and it's not even new, but like for me it was new, was a newsroom that was just set up in the market square with a blackboard saying like, what do you want to talk about? Like, if we talk about how representative is your newsroom, how many women are there, how many minorities are part of it, like that's all trying to fix something that starts from the fact that you're actually very remote from your audience. That's a problem, like when we go in, like my stories come from the audience, and I'm sort of one-on-one with my audience because they make the stories, not me.
I have so many more questions, but I think that's a good point at which to engage you guys, because I'm sure there are people who are cursing under their breath, just like this is heresy.
Did I insult anyone?
Probably not. I think what you said is something that people think about often, but we work in a very different environment, right? You sort of think about how far removed am I from my audiences, but I still have to file, I still have, we're still trying to grow audiences, and we're trying to engage with language. I have to, credit to the people who come to this session, because you're already thinking about what language means and how do you use it in your newsroom. So perhaps now is a good time to hear from you about some of your experiences, any reactions at this point to what you've already heard said, a few. So we'll take the lady first and then the gentleman. Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Lily from the New York Times. I just wanted to ask, when you talk about these different, your type of reporting methods, talking to people in their own language and translating, what sort of forms do these stories take in the end?
That's a good question, because I very often advocate against stories, which is very unnatural. And I mean, sitting next to somebody, I know we all love stories, right? No.
How do you tell the story,
No.
whether it's on a certain platform or through a certain type of narrative or type of media?
Yeah.
What do you come up with in the end?
Yeah, so I mean, and again, like I very often need to, like when I put together a team and I give them a briefing and then we get going, like I almost always have to sort of prevent them to think too much in story formats. Because in the end, like when you're in the middle of a storm, and that's where we differ from, I think, one of the ways that we differ from like typical journalism, when you're in the middle of a storm, I don't want to read about a storm. I'm not interested in a good story about somebody in the storm. I want to know where I can find shelter. And so very often the narrative is not necessarily like how to build up like a good opening quote and then like the broader context and a nice little sort of exit. No, it's like, where can I find shelter? So very often it's boring. Or very often it's really just like, that's your problem. Let's see if we can sort of get a solution, get somebody to answer to your question. And so it can have lots of formats. Like we work around rumors a lot. So we do rumor tracking. That's another format. But I'm very fascinated by it because for a start, it forces you to listen. You cannot make up your own rumors because they're usually too wild. You could not have imagined it yourself. But it also means that you have to preserve the language, and that's where we get back also to the title of this topic. It's not just about Arabic and what kind of Arabic. It's also like, are you actually taking somebody serious, even if it's formulated in a way that you're like, no, wait a minute, like you're a Moroccan and you think your king is going to fly in helicopters to pull you out of Lesbos because why? Like, that's a rumor. It's super fascinating. That's how people talk about it. They're certainly expecting all problems to be solved. Now, what I do with it is not necessarily write a nice story about the King of Morocco or about this idiot who doesn't understand that that's not going to happen. It's like, what are their options? What is it actually that they can do? What is it that they can expect?
So is that what News That Moves is? Is
Yeah.
it just a series of sort of information along the way? You must do...
Yeah, we do a lot more.
So what is it that, concretely, once you've gone into the community and have understood from the ground up what they want, how do you then present whatever it is you decide you're presenting?
The reality is that it's still very much an editorial process. So we do have in the team people who come from a refugee background. So that gives us a little bit of a reality check. But it's an editorial process. We go through whatever we gathered among the community. And again, this particular response with the refugees was very hard because normally we just recruit among what in the jargon is called the affected population. And they can start talking to each other. But in this case, they were not interested. They were like 24 hours on Lesbos in the beginning. Now they're a bit stuck. But so that means that we still derive different kinds of information from it. And that can still be a much more elaborate sort of like, okay, what are your options for the relocation program across Europe? Why is it not working? We do add layers of analysis to it, but we do want to provide that whole spectrum from very basic to maybe a little bit more, but always written in for refugees and what we call news you can use. Like,
Sure.
Is it actionable? Can you actually
Yep.
like make a better decision after reading this?
Okay. Let's take the gentleman's question here.
It's really fascinating what you're doing, and I was interested to hear you say that it's not journalism. So what are the key things that you think you're bringing to this process? What are the key sort of what's the key value you're bringing? Is it the language? Is it translating? Is it providing a platform? Is it logistical? Is it verification? How would you describe it?
It's a few of those things. One is that right now there's a lot more available, but definitely like a year ago, like in languages with information about their journey with that focus was not necessarily available. To the verification process, and that's another very challenging thing when you talk about audience engagement is, do you want to just add banter to it? Like, do you want to just open all the doors and give the platform, as I so nicely put at the beginning, and then remove yourself from it and see what kind of like chat comes from it? I think that's just adding to the noise that is already existing online. So yes, verification is definitely something that we bring into the mix. News That Moves tries to be a very boring, down-to-earth, not agenda-driven. We're not activists. We're not giving advice. So that's also where we very often are different from lots of NGOs who want to change people's behavior and like wash your hands and do this and do that. And it's like, no, we keep very factional, down-to-earth, but practical information. That's where there's also a difference with Al Jazeera or other big media houses who have extensively covered the refugee crisis, but it's a story. It's a story about the crisis. It's not necessarily actionable. And if I'm a refugee and I'm on Lesbos, or if I'm a Moroccan, which is actually a much better example, what the hell are you going to do, you know? And Al Jazeera might tell you there's Moroccans and BBC and CNN, and I don't want to favor anybody, but that is a situation, but not necessarily what the options are.
Let's take a few more together. Yes, please, two of you. Or should we just take all three of you because you're all on the same row? Should we start with you at the end?
So I grasp the philosophical, and I get it and I respect it, and I don't hate you. Right? But on the actual, real practical side, what are we talking about? What's the format? Is there a website per crisis? Are there printed booklets? Are there Like, how are you actually disseminating the information?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely been another big challenge for us.
So tell us now what you have got.
So there's a website, it's in 4 languages. We want to do more, but one of the things that actually stopped us was we could have translated, like you can translate Without Borders as an NGO, they translate whatever you want to whatever language that is available. But I didn't want to work in a language that we didn't have in the team. And so that's why we limit ourselves to those 4 languages. We have Greek, we have Arabic, we have Farsi, and we have English. The process is still in English, which is important because actually I would prefer it to go straight into Arabic, straight into Farsi, but that means that you actually have to have parallel teams who have all the skills and capacities to actually manage that process, etc. We couldn't pull that off. We have very limited funding. People like us, but not that much. And so we have to find practical solutions. That gets in through our refugee liaison officers, but also what we call refugee liaison officers. Horrible name, I know. We go through the editorial process. We find the facts through our network. Because we're an NGO, we actually have access to other NGOs that journalists don't have. They get referred to the spokesman, and they're horrible because NGOs love to be in control of the message, and they're terrified of bad news, and so they spin everything and they control everything. But we get actually access to them in a much easier way because we're considered an NGO and one of them. And then we publish it online. But because we don't believe that, first of all, people will find you, there's a lot of things online. Why would they come to News That Moves? I mean, you might build up an audience, but that audience is on the move and on its way to Germany, and then they have a lot of other concerns to take care of.
Maybe not data on their phones.
Yeah, and lots of issues around that. They're changing SIM cards, blah, blah, blah. So we also go offline. We print a lot. We go to like what we consider key locations, that is from eat places to charging stations for the phones to like registration queues to whatever we can find. We push out a lot of like print. And the third, and that's a very important one, is that we, and that's another advantage of being considered a humanitarian agency, or we are, and so, is that other agencies use us. So typically, this response has been driven by volunteers, not even professional humanitarians. It was all the volunteers. They have daytime jobs. They've never done anything like this before. The humanitarian system is horrible to navigate. So they're very happy to get like very clear, simple, actionable information that is up to date and that keeps coming on a daily basis, so they can inform refugees.
So you publish daily?
Yeah. We have multiple stories a day.
In all your languages?
In all the languages, yeah.
Okay.
And we have a Facebook page in Farsi and a Facebook page in Arabic, and that's another channel to reach out. But people is very, very important. And the army of volunteers and the army of frontline aid workers, that even if they're professionals, they can't keep up with like what is Serbia doing today? I have like you don't know. So they're very happy to use us, and that gives us another channel, which is people face to face.
Can we take your question?
I work for news media that broadcasts and publishes online in 13 languages, so I understand where you're coming from when you're talking about the challenges of having multilingual teams and multilingual content. My question is, we have a Farsi website, and they use Telegram, an application for news gathering.
Yeah.
Is that something that you use as well?
I have it on my phone.
So for those of us who don't know what it is, could you want to tell us what it is?
It's a chat app that's extremely popular in Iran, mostly because the other ones are banned, and that gives us a link with them. We're based in France, but it gives them a direct link with the community. And the second question, your project right now is called News That Moves. When are you going to stop moving? You're going to go all the way to like the door of the refugee center in Europe. That's the plan.
Yeah. I mean, and we already have people in Germany, and because a lot of information is also about Germany. People want to know, like, what is it like? Like, if I go to Germany, can I actually visit my aunt who is maybe in a different city than where my center is? And like all these very, like, that's how people like base their decisions on those facts. But we also had a lot of conversations about our title, and like things are not moving that much anymore. But yeah, like for now we'll just keep it. But yeah, we've always had stringers. Like that's a model that also comes from journalism all across the region, who would like getting like like information from refugees and fact-checking about local information in Serbia and Croatia, all the way up to Germany. So that has always been part of it. If you go to the website, you have like tabs for all the countries that people, most of the countries that people have been traveling through. And yeah.
So beyond just questions, oh yes, please.
You mentioned that, I mean, recruiting amongst the affected population, your term, whatever you want to call it. How have you been maintaining those relationships on like a very practical level? Are you giving people phones? Are you encouraging them with WhatsApp? I mean, what are you doing to maintain that connection and also ensure that they're actually giving it straight? Because you said there are a lot of rumors and people read the news and know what to say and what not to say.
Yeah. From the start, we have been looking for ways to do this because we like to get like a sort of relationship with our audience. And again, this was very much challenged. And as much as we kept in touch with some of the people that we met, and we thought like, hey, if you're in the next center, in the next country, like send us an update and like inform us about what's going on. Much more than that we would expect them to distribute the information that we have. When it's about how do you know for sure that we don't, like we simply don't. Like we had to make a very fundamental decision at the start, whether our website would allow for download, share, liking, etc. And that was a bit of a hefty discussion because of course, if it's on your website, you can like remove it when it's outdated, and like you can change it when the information is like etc. has changed, etc. But then that expects and that people will come to you. And if you have to go fast and you want to build up an audience very fast, and like we're not the BBC, you know, we're not a known brand. We're not one of those big ones where people will go to anyway. So I don't believe that works. So the alternative is everything is downloadable, everything can be shared, everything, but you need to have a logo on it, not because we want to promote ourselves, but you need to have a source. Like if it's wrong, I want people to contact us and say like, you guys, and it has a date stamp on it, that at least you can assess like, well, this is from October last year, will that still be correct? So that's the choice we made, but as a result, I don't know what people, but I think that's a fear that like people watch all these very reputable media houses and they make their own brew of that information as well, you know. I like.
So what are your metrics? How do you guys measure whether or not this sort of multilingual program is successful in engaging your target audiences?
Like we have a few indicators that donors like numbers. So that's Facebook facilitates a lot of like measurement.
Do you measure downloads?
Yeah. So that like everything that relates to our website, everything that relates to like our Facebook pages, that is quite easy. But like the choices we made makes it also impossible to have a real sense of impact. So it's very often anecdotal. Like we talk to people or people talk to like other people and they tell us like, hey, yeah, I know this from that website, or I've, you know, like, and that's reassuring. It's not measurable, but we get more and more questions coming in through our Facebook and through our website. People start referring to us a lot. Also, other humanitarian agencies. Local media in Greece use us a lot because we publish in Greek. They use us as an information source that helps them to navigate that whole crisis. So we see our information popping up almost like a news agency like Reuters or AFP. They make news out of what we produce, but that's anecdotal at best.
Okay. I'd really be curious to hear what your experiences are, if anyone. How many people here are working on publications that publish in multiple languages? That's about half. Why? Does anybody want to share? It'd be really great to hear what some of the challenges you're facing. I mean, I spied the Beeb at the front, so we know why you guys are doing it, and you've done it for a very long time. But any sort of newer publications or any newer decisions to publish across lots of different languages, it'd be really good to hear some experience in.
Yes, so my name's Glenn Cates. I work at Radio Free Europe, and we actually broadcast in 28 different languages, mostly in Eastern Europe, but also, you know, Iran, Pakistan, Afghanistan. And actually, it's been one thing that's been really interesting is taking stuff actually in the Russian language from places that are sort of in Russia's periphery, but the Russian audience might not understand. We had a situation, in Chechnya, where the Chechen leader, when he speaks nationally, he speaks in Russian. When he speaks locally, he's usually speaking in Chechen language. We're really lucky in the fact that we have Chechen language speakers right, like, a few doors down, and it's really a way to tell when you have this situation. A few months ago, the Chechen leader brought in this woman who had sent some negative messages about him on WhatsApp. He actually publicly humiliated her on Chechen TV. Now, mind you, this is happening in Russia, but Russian speakers would never know this was happening in their country. But because we were able to actually translate this stuff that happened into the Russian language, people actually did realize that this was happening in their country, and it had an impact. You had Russians asking on social media, like, is this translation real? And you had Chechens saying, yeah, brother, like, this is the real thing. And I think this sort of example that, I think Radio for Europe actually is uniquely positioned for this, but it really gives you the opportunity to take stories that are sort of right out in front of you, and spread them to a much larger audience. And I think you have lots and lots of examples of that, including with the refugee crisis.
Does everyone find that the only way to make this work and do it credibly is investment in people and time, or are there any sort of tools that is making, that can take one organization and immediately turn you into some sort of like multilingual beast overnight? Or is it all about, having people who speak the language, understanding the context? Yes?
I'm sorry, I just want to say,
No, go
I
ahead.
think having the people is really the most important thing. You can translate something, but if you don't have like the cultural context, it makes no sense whatsoever. I think the people there are by far the most important.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
Yes.
I work at the New York Times, and we have been publishing for a few years now, spent a Chinese language edition and now have a Spanish language edition as well. But my observation from when I was on the opinion side of the New York Times, we commissioned many essays on a one-off basis from foreign writers, and then had them had the simultaneous translation, was that there's this dream, I think. The reason why machine translation is simply not that good, and of course I use Google Translate all the time, it's better than nothing, but I think the reason why it will never kind of be perfect, because translation is so much more of an art than a science, right? And one thing that we found is that it's really expensive to do it well.
Yeah.
Because anyone can do a crappy translation.
Yeah.
To do a translation that captures nuance and precision, but also sounds idiomatically correct, as opposed to just kind of functionally correct.
Yeah.
That's the level of translation that we think our readers in Spanish and Chinese expect from us. It's very costly. If I can pose one question, if you don't mind, staying, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious about one thing, if you don't mind me asking a personal question. We've been doing a lot of stories in Belgium recently, which is a country that seems very fragmented along linguistic as well as other lines. And one of the things that we talk about is the language politics of Belgium and why, the French-speaking community seems to refuse to learn Dutch or Flemish, whereas the Flemish community most seems at least have a working knowledge of French. And I'd be curious if your perspective to the field have informed your thoughts about your country.
And the other way around, like, I'm not going to go into Belgian politics, don't worry, but like, coming from Belgium, there's a small anecdote that I sometimes tell people when I'm getting into a new country, and like, I was in Nepal with the earthquake, and you will go to Kathmandu and everybody will tell you, but people speak Nepali, Newari, like, that's no problem. And it's like, yeah, let's see. And of course that's the difference between knowing it as a sort of school language and actually being comfortable to talk in, like what I said before. Like Walt Disney, like, they know their stuff, right? Like, they're pretty good at what they're doing. For years, they didn't make profit in Belgium. Not at all. Like, one of the few countries in the world where they didn't make profit. Why? Because we got, like, on the French-speaking side, the movies dubbed in France, And on the Dutch-speaking side, the movie's dubbed in Holland. We don't like listening to Dutch people. They don't like listening to French people. It was just not popular. And so it's much more, it was correct, right? Like we speak the same language. It's grammatically, linguistically, completely the same language. And yet we didn't like Walt Disney because we didn't get it in our own idiomatic language. So I think that helped me to explain in many places around the world, like it's much more than do they understand you. Like if you want to get engagement going, they need to perceive that, and not just as a sort of gimmick, but they need to understand that it actually comes from them, that you're talking with them. And that goes beyond like having it grammatically correct, you know? Like, and I think that's what you're experiencing. And yeah, like the other way around, like, anyway, like I think that's my Belgian perspective on things. Like it's more emotional than scientific language. So you have to like, and again, like the whole topic of today is engagement. Like if I feel like you're talking from London to me in Lesbos or from Paris, or like I don't feel like I can interact with you. It's a distance. I very strongly believe in proximity. You know, I need to feel like you're here with me.
Yes, there's one of them. Please.
I work with Nonprofit Foundation. Actually, start as AlertNet. It's very similar to what you do. Is basically to give information to people on the field, to aid workers. Like, well, a long time ago, 10 years ago. Now we transfer to a new site called news.trust.org, and I work with multimedia, and I mainly do video and. So basically, the second thing I want to say is I work with language in 3 levels. First is my mother tongue is Chinese. So when I film, I go back to China, I film something, and people would tell me saying, this is so touching, because I will spend a lot of time with the people I film with, I speak the same language, understand what we're talking about, and then when I translate to English, I will try to make sure culturally it's correct. And the second level is I recently actually went to Brussels. I film with refugees, and they learn language, and they also speak Arabic. I don't understand what they're talking about, but I follow them. I was in the process of filming, and I do build a connection with them. I try to speak English with them. And then when I come back and I edit the footage, I work with 2 translators. One speak Dutch, the other one speak Arabic, and make sure everything is correct and the culture is correct as well. But on the other hand, I can't speak the language. I can only make sure they're correct. And to trust the translators. The third level is I only do the editing, and then I'm actually editing a film in Ethiopia, in a very small village. I like 1,000 people speak that tribal language, and then I can only trust one person who speaks the language, translate and film and ask questions and interpret at the same time. And then when the translator comes back, he will tell us saying, oh, those people are so uneducated, I have to work very hard to translate what they said. And now what happened is, when an editor look at the film and say, looks like you're putting words into people's mouths. It's like, yeah, I feel that way as well. So we need to rewrite that, but on the other hand, the translator doesn't really the meaning doesn't really come across very well. So that's kind of 3 levels I work with language. It's just my own experience.
Does anybody else have that experience? Because that last thing you've just said makes me think about, you know, you at the end know what story you want. You have your culture in your own newsroom and how you sort of deal with the people you speak with and what you want. But actually, if you're working with an interpreter, their own personal culture, their culture, you know, in terms of what they then have that power, right, as the intermediary, how they want their own people to come across and what they want it to sound like. How do people deal with that if you can't understand the language in the first place and have to rely on a translator who doesn't necessarily work for your organization to sort of embody those same values and not morph the results?
I think you have to trust your gut, because I think when you're in the field, or again, my personal experience, you can sense when something isn't, whether it's the length of the stream of the phrase or what they were saying, and it ends up just saying, you know, it was really scary. So I think you can trust your gut. It's also a matter of finding a way to, it's not training your interpreter or translator, but finding an understanding. Like sometimes it'll take 15 repetitions and you'll just keep going at it and say, no, every single word she said, however she said it, grammatically incorrect, if it makes no sense, I don't care, I just want to hear it for myself. Some, especially local interpreters will pick it up just like that, others you work on it. But I think it's a matter of like, you know when it's not coming across properly, and it's up to you as a journalist or an aid worker to make sure that you're pushing to get the right information. And I mean, in Brussels, it's a matter of Flemish, French, but also specifically Belgian French, and in different neighborhoods, people use different slang. So if I speak French fluently, I had no idea what the hell some kids were saying on the streets of, I mean, various neighborhoods, Scarbeck, Molenbeek, whatever it was. So you gotta push for it, but it's worth it. And I think that going into like the refugee crisis, I think was unique because the socioeconomic level of a lot of the people that are moving through have given them a level of education that you might not find, and funds that you might not find in like a rural village in Chad or in Ethiopia. So it's a bit easier to get that across. So without having the proximity of someone who lives there, breathes it, eats it, something can be lost.
I do find that with the refugee crisis, there's been far more of an interest in language than there's ever been with sort of decades of reporting Africa, for example. It's kind of, I think it's because the problem is at our door, and so trying to understand it and understand how people, but you know, a lot of the sort of complexities of trying to understand people and their perspectives and their rumors doesn't even apply when, you know, to a lot of foreign reporting. Trevor, how much time do we have before I ask this gentleman to sum up?
Yeah, it's probably about time to sum up.
Yeah. Right, well then stay and sum up.
Well, I mean, so
and it would be good to be as practical as you can, because, you know, then, because we get the philosophy, but some of the stuff that you're concretely doing to try and bring that barrier down, what would be your lessons learned?
I think some of it, what already was also said in the audience, is like you need to have people in your team. Like you can't do it from a distance. And Google Translate or a translator somewhere else out of the context, they just can't do a proper job. Like it's, for me, that's a very important lesson. Two is it's much more than just, again, getting the language right. It's understanding the situation. And so that is frustrating in a way, because how do you scale that up on the other hand? Like if you want to cover the whole of Europe, like some people here, or like us, like 6 different countries, yet like don't produce in languages that you don't master yourself, because if you want to get engagement, if you really want people to interact with you, you have to look for that register, and it is a process. And most of the sort of very tough battles that I have is very often with those intermediators that are like suddenly, like, because they think we're a reputable organization, which I hope we are, but like they start sort of scaling up their language. It's like, no, like I want to hear like exactly what you said. So it's engagement comes from like understanding the context, speaking the language in the way that they're like talking, not just in the way that they understand what you're saying, but in the way that they are talking about. I think those are very crucial. So that's why we're not producing in Urdu, for instance. I mean, we could have easily added the translation service in Urdu, but we didn't have staff who spoke it. Then I'd rather not, you know? And I think the refugee crisis showed us that we don't have the luxury to go in and act like we can just push out content and do one-to-many broadcasting style messaging in the NGO context, and then think that we're reaching our audience, you know? And then we put a box with a hole in it, and then we ask questions, and then that's going to solve our like relationship with the audience. It's like, no, you don't have the luxury. And we've been the humanitarians, the NGOs have been doing that in Africa for a long time.
Yep.
But I've always hated it. I've worked there. It's like, guys, how can you like expect that anything meaningful comes out of this relationship?
Okay. I was going to sum that up, but I don't think I can. So, but I think what you said to start off with in your conclusion, which is, work in the areas where you have got the capacity. Don't overreach yourself, because it's important to be as close to the story to understand the nuance, to understand the politics of the language, to understand the local context as much as you can. So thank you all for coming to the session. I think we're going straight into the closing plenary, but we're both here if anybody has any sort of burning issues or diatribes for later. But yeah, thank you for coming.